let's take a trip down memory lane. Let's talk about what happened in 2024 when game journalists rallied and tried to tell us that Metaphor Refantazio, the new Atlas RPG, was not only one of the best Atlas games ever produced, that it was one of the best selling games ever made. That this was this huge genre defining, culturally relevant, amazing RPG. This was one of the biggest releases of 2024, and if you didn't play this game, you were missing out. Game journals were really pushing this nonsense. They were really going all out trying to sell people on this idea that like Metaphor Refantasio was going to be like some amazing thing, that it was some like extremely well received like RPG that everyone was excited about it, and yeah, a year later, nobody even remembers it came out. Like this was a game that did like about as well as Shin Megami Tensei 5, that trailed well behind like Persona 5 in relevancy. This was like a massive game journal Astroturfing campaign. Like no different really than what they tried with Astrobot or Clair Obscure Expedition 33. Like this is just yet another example of how game journals are all bark and no bite. Like their products that they try and sell people don't even really stay relevant for like the full year. Maybe a couple of months of relevancy until they get buried by some like, bigger release. That seems to be how these things go, because these games don't seem to cultivate like an actual dedicated following. They don't seem to like have any long-term relevancy. Like Nintendo fans aren't asking for the game to be ported to Switch 2, right? Like Metaphor Refantasio is just like this RPG that came and went, even though it was hyped up as being one of the all-time greats. Like it really was last year's version of Expedition 33. The same exact mentality, the same exact behavior, the same exact like culture, right? These people do not play RPGs, and that's why they're so adamant that these titles that clearly are not on the same level as like the actual gems of the industry are just being propped up and worshipped and just considered some of the all-time greats. And like I do think we do need to like talk about like why this is happening and what's going on here, because I do think that game journals have realized that their their established narrative that PlayStation is inherently superior to Nintendo, and that like there are all these third party games that are coming out, like all of that is falling flat because like so many Nintendo games now like outperform even like the biggest of PlayStation titles. Sony like lies about Horizon sales. They lie about like Astrobot's like relevancy. They lie about like third party games. Like there's just so much that they lie about. So game journals have to like artificially prop up new IPs that come out to try and get them to have even a little bit of traction. So with Expedition 33, with Astrobot, with like Baldur's Gate 3, like with Elden Ring, like they just worship these games and act like there's some like major deals, like some huge cultural phenomenons, and some just amazing thing, when in reality they're just they just have left no impact at all. Because it's very interesting that like Metaphor Refantasio is considered this huge deal, this huge cultural phenomenon. One of the best RPGs ever made, and yet like sales wise, it trails well behind like Fire Emblem Three Houses. It trails well behind Persona 5. It trails well behind like it's on par with Shin Megami Tensei 5, a game that the same people hated actually. So like the difference in like critical reception, and yet like the almost identical like commercial success kind of demonstrates something that does need to be emphasized when it comes to these games, is that like the multi-plat approach of having games on Xbox, PlayStation, and PC so that they can maybe outperform the Nintendo consoles. This tactic is imploding and has been for a long time. people are beginning to realize just how much better Nintendo games are. And it started with Breath of the Wild, and extended with like Mario Odyssey, and of course, like they're fans of like smaller Nintendo IPs like Fire Emblem and Xenoblade, Metroid, and stuff like that. But like with Donkey Kong Bonanza, I do think we're kind of expanding outside of the realm of previously established Nintendo franchises, because like the narrative for a long time was that like you only buy games for like major Nintendo games, Mario, Zelda, and Pokemon. And Donkey Kong Bonanza kind of has showcased that a stagnant Nintendo IP that was downplayed by game journalists for a long time can make a glorious return to form and be hugely popular and successful. Even with game journos actively doing everything in their power to downplay and ignore it. Not only the game itself, but the console it's on. Like, we are in this position now where people are outright ignoring what game journos are saying about games. Like, they don't care. This isn't 1997. Game journos can't gaslight people into thinking Final Fantasy VII is the greatest thing ever made when it's not even as good as Final Fantasy VI. Like this isn't the same culture where they can like dictate how people reacted to new Zelda game announcements. Right, the Wind Waker reveal was entirely a game journo like knee jerk reaction, right? It had nothing to do with like the actual players. It was like game journalists trying to dictate like how disappointed they were with Nintendo not going in a more mature direction. You know, it's kind of amazing to kind of look back and see at just how like these people traditionally complained about Nintendo games not being mature or adult enough, and going onward to see just how absolutely those decisions have paid off spectacularly for Nintendo. Not only do they have like iconic child friendly brands, they also have their more adult content that is far more successful than the competition's adult content. Even if we are in that weird position where like nobody really wants to admit it. Fire Emblem 100% is more successful than Persona. Like it's a weird thing for people to like wrap their heads around, but Fire Emblem is just so good, and is just growing all the time, while Persona and the Atlas stuff is just becoming stagnant and just becoming like unable to grow and evolve. And I think like Metaphor Refantazio really demonstrates that very well. In spite of all the hype, all the praise, all the attention, this game has done absolutely nothing special.